Hello, and welcome to Archive West Texas. I'm your host, Gordon Wilkerson, joined today as always by our producer, Thomas Dye. We're pleased today to have Dr. Robert Salem, a pioneering cardiovascular surgeon, with us. He's been a tremendous contributor to Lubbock over his career, and we're really grateful that he's taken time today to share a little bit of his story with us today. Welcome, Dr. Salem.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Happy to be here.
Been reading your book, Sandstorms and Surgery.
Yes.
As a background, had a chance to take a look at the documentary that PBS produced called Salem, the Heart of West Texas.
Right.
You grew up in Sudan, about 50 miles north of here. Tell us a little bit about your family, your parents, and your early years.
My dad and mom had a little department store there in Sudan, population 974 when I grew up there. And so that's where I was raised all through junior high and high school. And it's a farming community and, good people there. So we enjoyed a good life there. And during that time, I had an inclination. I wanted to do something to serve people. I didn't know it would be medicine necessarily, but when I was out hoeing cotton in the fields, I would see these frogs jumping around. I wondered what they looked like inside, and I'd grab one of them and start dissecting the insides. So I think that's kind of what led me down the medicine pathway. And then I went on to college at Texas Tech, where I studied pre-med, majored in chemistry, and graduated in 1950. And then following that, I went on to medical school at Southwestern Medical. And the first year I was at Southwestern Medical, the Korean War started, and I was drafted. And I asked for a deferment to let me finish medical school. They granted that with the condition that I would serve 3 years of active duty once I graduated. And I took them up on the deal, and because I wanted to get my MD degree before I went into the service. I was afraid if I had to go now and serve those 2 years, obligatory 2 years at that time, I might never get back. So they were true to their word. The day after I graduated from Southwestern Medical School, I took off my graduation cap and I had on a first lieutenant U.S. Air Force uniform and orders in hand to report immediately to Fitzsimmons Army Hospital in Denver. I had elected to go into the Air Force because I always had a love of flying, and they gave me the choice of which branch of service I could go into. But I was assigned to Fitzsimmons Army. They had a teaching program in the Army, and they didn't have as many teaching programs in the Air Force. So I was sent to Fitzsimmons Army Hospital in Denver for a year of internship. And I wasn't up there very long when the roof fell in, when the sitting president of the United States at the time, Dwight Eisenhower, was admitted there. He was playing golf on the Fitzsimmons Army Hospital golf course when he had a heart attack. He had been down visiting his in-laws. His wife's parents lived in Denver, and they were down for that. So the hospital was immediately transformed into the White House for a period of time, and he had sustained this heart attack. But the treatment for heart attacks back then was quite different from it is today. Back in the day, that was in 1956. Treatment was basically a prolonged bed rest with anticoagulation, blood thinners, and vasodilators, medicine to dilate the arteries to increase the circulation. We did consult a cardiologist from Boston at the time, the leading cardiologist, Paul Dudley White, and he came down. Dr. White said, I've got one additional recommendation for President Eisenhower's care. And everybody said, well, what is that? And he said, well, we need to cut his cigarette smoking down from 4 packs a day to 1 pack a day. So it was kind of funny nowadays. You look back on that, seeing a sitting president in a chair recovering from a heart attack, smoking his cigarette that day to that he had about every hour until he used up his pack. So the Korean War was over toward the end of that year, and I didn't have to go to Korea. And they said, why don't you just tell us where you'd like to go, because for your remaining 2 years, they'll probably let you go or be assigned wherever you want to. And I said, well, just send me to some base in Texas. I'm going to probably end up practicing there. Give me a chance to kind of look around. And so a few weeks later, I got a call from headquarters, and they say, well, you're going to Paris. I said, well, Paris. I said, how far is that from Dallas? They said, no, the other Paris, the one that's got the Eiffel Tower in France. And so I packed up and went to France, and was stationed at a U.S. Air Force hospital there that served all of the main airport in Paris at the time was Orly. Today it's Charles de Gaulle and Le Bourget, but Orly serviced all of the military and all of the civilian aircraft. So we had a 20-bed hospital on the grounds of that airfield, and we took care of all the personnel there at the airfield and also all the NATO people. At the time, Paris was headquarters for NATO, and they had a big complex not too far from our hospital and our base, and so we managed all of those civilians and military independents that needed care there. During that time, of course, this was just 10 years after the end of World War II, and there were Army and air bases all over Europe. And we provided out of Paris in our airport all of the air evacuations and coordinated all the air evacuations all over Europe. I had a chance to fly to Berlin several times, and we still had a squadron of men up there. And the interesting part about that is that after World War II ended, you will recall that Russia and America divided up Germany into East and West. We got West and they got East. And Berlin itself, which was located in East Germany, was also divided into East and West. And we got West Berlin and they got East Berlin. And we had a squadron of men still in West Berlin, which was in East Germany. So to take care of those guys from Paris, we had to fly up to West Berlin through a strict air corridor. The Russians gave us, the British and the English, an air corridor 10 miles wide through which you had to stay in to get to West Berlin. So we made several trips up there, and if you got too close to your edge, you were immediately accompanied on your wing by a Russian MiG fighter, and he would wave his wings up and down. He wasn't saying, "Good morning, how you guys doing?" He was saying, "Get the heck out of here."
Yeah.
And we did. We didn't have any untoward events, just a lot of intimidation.
That's good. We need to take a quick break here.
Okay.
When we return, we'll talk a little bit more about your time in Europe and
Okay.
ultimately how you made your way to Baylor College of Medicine.
Good story there.
We'll take a quick break here. I want to remind all of our listeners that each episode of Archive West Texas, including this show, are available on demand on our station app, also on our website at classical1057.org. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're continuing our conversation today with Dr. Robert Salem. Dr. Salem, in the first segment, we talked about you growing up in the cotton fields in Sudan and dissecting frogs, making your way to Tech and ultimately Southwestern Medical. And before you know it, the kid from the cotton fields is working with the sitting president of the United States in Denver and making his way to Paris, France. Let's continue the conversation and continue the story and ultimately talk about how you made your way down to Baylor College of Medicine.
Sure. Yeah, it's quite interesting. A little kid from Sudan, Texas, ended up in a NATO hospital in Paris. It's a unique story in my mind too. But once I got to Paris at this NATO hospital, as I mentioned, we had bases all over Europe, and from the end of World War II, and after after the war. Let me back up there. I'm sorry. Before the war started, President Eisenhower was then a five-star general in the Army, and he was the architect of the D-Day invasion when all of the Allies came together and did the Normandy invasion on the coast of France in June 6, 1944. And this was the beginning of the liberation of all of West Europe from German occupation. But as a result of that, when he won the war, he was probably the most popular person in the entire world and had no problem getting elected president for 2 terms. But he was highly regarded by all of the military people that I talked to, and knowing him personally, he was a rare individual. But during the time I was stationed at this NATO hospital, we had bases all over Europe. We went to Marseille. One of the interesting stories about it, we made several trips to Geneva. Interesting that we could get more French francs from in Geneva than we could in Paris. We got paid in U.S. military certificates, MPCs, they were called, like U.S. dollars. And we converted those into French francs to pay for our French expenses. But if we flew an airplane up to Geneva, we could get 10% more in our dollar in Geneva than we could in Paris. So we went up there frequently with a bag of cash and came back with a bunch of U.S. dollars. And then we flew to Italy, to North Africa one time. We had during the World War II, there was a battle going on over there. In fact, World War II was a global war. We were fighting in Africa, we were fighting in Europe, we were also fighting in Japan, you recall. So it was a global war. And during that time, I had an opportunity to scrub in surgery at the American Hospital in Paris with a colonel surgeon. We didn't do any major surgery at our hospital on the base there. And when I had a patient that needed surgery, I would send the patient down to the American Hospital in Paris and scrub in with this Army colonel surgeon. And I had always thought I might like to be a surgeon, and I loved anatomy and chemistry and so forth and related subjects. And so this sort of fine-tuned me in my thinking that I did want to be a surgeon. So I was far removed from the residency training programs in the United States and didn't know a whole lot about them. But I ran into, by coincidence, one day a lady who was over there with her husband, a businessman from Houston. And she was a nurse anesthetist, and we got acquainted, and I was subsequently told her about my desire to be a surgeon. She said, "Bob, if you want to be a surgeon," said, "you need to go to Houston and try to work with Dr. DeBakey and Dr. Cooley, Dr. Michael DeBakey and Dr. Denton Cooley." She said, "They're doing things there that have never been done before." For example, Dr. DeBakey has developed a synthetic artery that will replace diseased arteries in the body. And he got that material from a department store. He went to a department store looking for some type of good material that would function as an artery. And he found this Dacron, and he came home and on his wife's sewing machine fashioned a tube out of 2 layers of Dacron, and that's what was the beginning of synthetic arteries. He used those Dacron segments that he made at home in animals first and then perfected it later on. And so he was pioneering that kind of surgery, doing abdominal aortic aneurysms and other related surgery. And then she said, Dr. DeBakey and Dr. Cooley are just now beginning to use the heart-lung machine for the first time on patients who need surgery for coronary artery obstructions. And anyway, I was intrigued by that, but I said, I'll never be able to get a residency with those guys. I said, I've been out of the country for 2 years. I don't know them. They don't know me. But she said, well, you just make an application. So I did. I made an application, and lo and behold, a few weeks later, I got a telegram from Dr. DeBakey saying I had been accepted. I didn't have a personal interview or anything, just the record on my application. So literally, I flew straight from Paris to start my residency in Houston with Dr. DeBakey as one of his first surgical residents. He had just come to Baylor College of Medicine in the early 50s, and then in the mid-50s had started up a surgical residency training program, and I'm there in 1958. Quite an intense 4 years, I must say. But after that 4 years, I felt like I had experienced one of the best training programs I could possibly have. And then I had to make a decision. Well, where am I going to go with all this training? And I had sworn when I left Lubbock in West Texas, off to medical school, I'd never come back to this sandstorm country again. But I talked to a few of my doctor friends that were doing general practice in some of the area around Lubbock, and they assured me that we didn't have the sandstorms like I did when we were growing up, and they encouraged me to come back to Lubbock to start a practice in surgery. So that's how I ended up coming back to surgery and never been sorry.
Well, you made an incredibly meaningful contribution to this entire area, and it was a great decision personally for you and professionally for you, but also a real blessing for this community.
Well, thank you.
We'll take a quick break here. I want to remind all of our listeners that each episode of Archive West Texas, including this show, are available on demand on our station app, also on our website at classical1057.org. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Archive West Texas. We're continuing our conversation with Dr. Robert Salem. Dr. Salem, you were telling us in our last segment about your time at Baylor Med on the forefront of cardiovascular surgery development with Dr. Michael DeBakey and Dr. Denton Cooley. You're a young man in a surgical residency there with two of the physicians that are now rightly regarded as pioneers in that particular discipline. Tell us what you learned from them, what it was like being there, and give us a feel for that experience at that time.
Sure. Well, it was a challenging time for me in terms of work ethic and all that. But when I arrived in Houston from Paris to start my training, Dr. DeBakey was chairman of the Department of Surgery at Baylor College of Medicine, and he had recruited Dr. Cooley from Johns Hopkins to be his vice chair. So I had the opportunity during those 4 years there to work with each man and in the operating room. And I've been asked several times, what were the demeanors of these two famous surgeons, who probably, as you mentioned, are the two of the most prominent surgeons in the history and annals of surgery. Were they similar? I said, oh, absolutely. They were opposite. DeBakey was bombastic and fiery and pumped and always in a hurry, and Dr. Cooley, on the other hand, was more calm in his demeanor and slower paced and all that. For example, DeBakey never took the elevator. He wouldn't wait on an elevator. He had to run up the stairs up and down Methodist Hospital there, and everybody following him. That sort of thing. But in the operating room, I can illustrate the difference between the two by this experience. if I'm assisting Dr. DeBakey on a case and some little something minor happens, like a little excessive bleeding that obscures the field for momentarily, he would throw down his dissecting scissors. He'd raise his hands to the ceiling, look up at the ceiling, and said, "Oh God, why are you persecuting me? You've surrounded me with imbeciles." And then the same thing with Dr. Cooley. If I'm helping him, same thing happens. He would simply say, "Well, Dr. Salem, if you don't know how to do this, just tell me and I'll do it myself." So different approach to, but cutting into your skin and heart, nevertheless. But the experience that I had, and the work load was incredible. I mean, as a third-year resident, I went into Dr. DeBakey's private service to run that service for 3 months. I walked into the hospital at 4 a.m. one morning to make rounds with him, and I left the hospital 3 months later. I did not leave the hospital. It was every day, 7 days a week, 20 hours a day on average, and a lot of people fell out and couldn't do it because physical and mental strain was too much, and I felt fortunate to be able to do that. But once I did get through all that, having worked 2-hour days in one, I had more experience than anybody could imagine, and a big variety of cases. So when I left, I felt confident that I could handle just about any vascular case and general surgical case that was to be confronted with, and that's what I brought to Lubbock.
DeBakey and Cooley had a little bit of a falling out at some point.
They did. Dr. DeBakey had worked all of his life to develop a total mechanical heart, and it had just about completed that, but it hadn't been tested yet thoroughly in animals nor humans. And on one occasion, when Dr. DeBakey was out of town, Dr. Cooley had a patient that was in desperate need of a heart, and he couldn't find a heart transplant. So he implanted Dr. DeBakey's artificial heart, which worked. It kept the patient alive. Several days later, they took it out when they got a heart transplant, and the patient did well. But when DeBakey got back to town and found that Dr. Cooley had implanted this total heart that he had been working on without his knowledge or permission, that created a split, a drastic split between the two. Dr. Cooley actually went right across the street from, right across Fannin Avenue there in Lubbock from Methodist, and established the Texas Heart Institute, which became world renowned, just like DeBakey's program. And for 40 years, these guys didn't even speak to each other, but each developed a dynasty in his own, and right there in Houston, not far from each other. Later on, Dr. DeBakey, toward the end of his life, had developed a dissecting thoracic aortic aneurysm at age 97. And there was consternation on the part of everybody in the hospital as to whether or not a man that old should be operated on, and because they didn't think he'd survive. Finally, they all came together. Dr. DeBakey agreed to go ahead with the surgery, but then they couldn't find an anesthesiologist to put him to sleep, because every anesthesiologist thought, well, he won't survive the anesthesia, and I don't want on my resume, I bumped off Mike DeBakey. And so, but they did finally find one, and they did the surgery successfully. One of my junior residents, George Noon, did the surgery. He was in Don Bricker's class, and he was a second-year resident with Don Bricker when I was chief resident. So he did the surgery. Dr. DeBakey lived another 2.5 years. And I went to see him 2 or 3 times in Houston while he was recovering. He was totally intact mentally, and it was a remarkable story that a man of that age with that serious surgery could survive and do well. Later on, Dr. DeBakey was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal by President Bush in Washington. He invited me to that private ceremony up there, which I attended. And he's 99 and 6 months of age now. and he gave the most erudite acceptance speech one has ever heard. So he was a remarkable person with a remarkable mind, as was Dr. Cooley.
So you're down in Houston. You've trained under two of the best surgeons ever known. You have all kinds of career opportunities, and you decide to come back to Lubbock. They've told you the sandstorms aren't as bad as when you grew up, but what was it? Who was instrumental in bringing you back to Lubbock to found it?
Well, I guess my father was a devout Methodist layman, and he was telling me about the Methodist hospital here, which I knew as a privately owned hospital, and one couldn't get, in fact, all the hospitals in Lubbock were privately owned by doctors usually, and one couldn't get on the staff unless you were hired by them to work for them. But in 1954, the Northwest Texas Conference of the Methodist Church assumed ownership of the hospital that these doctors had built and named it Methodist Hospital. And one of the first things that Methodist Hospital did was to convert it to an open staff hospital, which meant that anybody could come who had the proper credentials could apply for and get accepted. And I had learned about that. In fact, I think that's one of the major milestones in medicine in Lubbock, because as a result of that, specialists and doctors from all fields started flocking into Lubbock, and that's one of the main reasons I came. Plus the fact that I knew a lot of people in the area, and I felt like I could get a practice started quicker, and so those were the factors that drew me back to Lubbock.
Well, thank you so much for talking through your backstory and your education. We're going to do another episode for next week, and in that episode we will talk about you coming back to Lubbock and how you helped establish general surgery and cardiovascular surgery here. I want to thank all our listeners for being with us today. We'll be back next week with another episode of Archive West Texas.